Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, December 7th, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 5 and the 26th webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. This is Topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and also the chairman of the committee. I am turning this webinar over to him now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, gentlemen, for participating in another very interesting discussion, I am certain, on the topic that Bob has described. For the sake of viewers who may not have been following our series, I will clarify the announcement by stating that it is fundamentally based on my long document, Revelation Revealed, that I wrote in the year 2016, but that today we will be discussing an essay, which is a supplement to Revelation Revealed, that I wrote in June. This essay is called Living the Real Religion of Jesus, and today we will be discussing page 6 of that essay and the ideas that it implies. For your information, I very strongly recommend that you download this document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Here is the citation of that website, www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. The word global endeavor is treated as if it is a single word, no space, no punctuation in the middle. The link to the essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, is about 2/3 of the way down the page. And the link to the long document, Revelation Revealed, is a few links beneath the link for Living the Real Religion of Jesus. As I said, we will be talking today entirely based on the essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. Now, because those of you watching do not have an opportunity to ask us questions while we are talking, you could, if you wish, send us in one or more questions by email. The link for that is the email address listed at the bottom of the website, and specifically info@globalendeavor.net. If you send us in a question, we reserve the right to edit the wording, and we might wish to use it during a future webinar. If we did that, you would then get an answer from the panel as a whole, not just from me personally. So I would now like to start the substantive discussion today. We are, as I said, talking about material on page 6 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. Specifically, we are addressing questions that pertain to the two quotations from remarks by Melchizedek that appear at the top of the page. One of them is from paper 98, and the other one is from paper 92. The questions that we will address are based on a separate document that I circulated to all participants in advance, and we have been discussing them for quite some time. Today, we are actually talking about the fourth question, and specifically, we will start with segment A of question 4, which pertains to those aspects of Christianity that descend from the theology of Judaism. Now, in specific terms, this question and parts 4B and 4C all relate to the second of the two excerpts from comments by Melchizedek that appear at the top of the page. And I would ask that, for the sake of creating a background that will make our discussion perhaps a little bit easier to understand, that the second excerpt be read out at this point. It begins, "The Christian religion is the religion about the life and teachings of Christ." Bob, do you have that in front of you? Could you read it for us, please? Just that one paragraph. You're muted, I'm sorry. All right.
I'm there now. Okay. The Christian religion is the religion about the life and teachings of Christ based upon the theology of Judaism, modified further through the assimilation of certain Zoroastrian teachings and Greek philosophy, and formulated primarily by three individuals, Philo, Peter, and Paul. It has passed through many phases of evolution since the time of Paul and has become so thoroughly occidentalized that many non-European peoples very naturally look upon Christianity as a strange revelation of a strange God and for strangers. 92:6:18.
Thank you. In effect, you have just mentioned the paragraph in the Urantia book from which this paragraph comes. It is paragraph 18 in section 6 of paper 92 by Melchizedek. Now, we have been discussing several very specific questions pertaining to these two excerpts. At the moment, we are in the process of discussing question 4A, and I read the question as follows. 4, please identify and analyze those aspects of Christianity that can be traced to A, the theology of Judaism. Now, we had a very interesting discussion of parts of this question during our preceding webinar, and I do not wish to repeat the ideas that we already exchanged, but I will offer the opportunity to anyone participating today who wishes perhaps to revisit something we said previously or simply to add to it. Does anyone wish to take up that opportunity? Andre, go ahead.
Well, what we didn't talk about last time, though we touched on the atonement doctrine, and we did speak about that, we didn't talk about one of the central ideas which led to the atonement doctrine, which was the whole notion of sacrifice. And sacrifice was a key thing imported from Judaism into Christianity. That was still there, even though Jesus now became the Lamb of God and the ultimate sacrifice to appease the King Judge, who was God. The Paul and all of them decided that ultimately the father nature would take second place to still the King Judge nature that had come over from Judaism, and sacrifice became all important. Else we wouldn't have had an atonement doctrine in the first place. So I thought it was just significant to mention that it makes its appearance in the general practice of Christians throughout the ages as well, where you had, and I don't want to butcher the name, but for instance, the pilgrimages such as going to Santiago de Postol, I was.
Is it Compostela?
Compostela, yeah.
Compostela, yeah.
Compostela, and the idea of making an arduous and grueling pilgrimage as part of showing one's devoutness, and then the idea of Mexicans crawling on their knees, and other nationalities as well, as part of their pilgrimages that have an element of sacrifice. All of those kinds of things have, as well as fasting, as well as any number of kinds of ideas. Incidentally, with regard to Santiago de Compostela, last year I was in Berlin, and while having a meal and a drink at a pub, ran into a fellow who had grown up in that town, and he affirmed what we could probably all surmise and suspect, and that was that while the pilgrimage certainly has a lot of religious significance for outsiders, like Mecca for those that are living in Mecca, it is a great business opportunity. And in fact, it was conceived that way from the beginning, and that history is well known by those who originate in that place. So once again, we have the idea of how materialism comes in to compromise spirituality. But that aside, sacrifice is something we inherited deeply, and we've I think Christianity has paid a high price in, again, having yet another, that sacrifice also sacrificed the teaching that God was a loving father. That took second place, even though it was still there.
Thank you, Andre. Stephen, before I recognize you, I would like to give two types of reactions myself to what Andre has just said. The concept of a pilgrimage became very important in many countries that were Christian in the Middle Ages. The most notable classic of early English literature is called The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. It's actually written in Middle English and therefore is not immediately accessible to us now, who are readers of modern English. But Chaucer wrote these stories about people who were en route to a pilgrimage, on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. And it was very clear from the stories that the religious motivations were not consistently at a high level, shall we say. Some of the stories are very raucous and ribald. But in any event, the concept of a pilgrimage was an important form of reverence and belief for perhaps 1,000 years in the Christian tradition. Now, the question of sacrifice, which is the most important part of what Andre just shared with us, has to do with a process that we can probably link to the idea of acculturation, a theme that Stephen Hecht has brought forward a number of times, whereby the pagan religions of the environment of the Roman Empire, in the Eastern Mediterranean and so on, all involve sacrificing animals to the pagan deities. And the sacrifice inherent in Judaism was a similarity that the Jewish practice had in relation to the pagan religions. And so in effect, the compromise that Paul's theology made was to eliminate the practice of sacrificing animals, but the disadvantage and the theological obstacle that we find very troublesome was that he turned Jesus into a sacrificial offering to the Father, and therefore implied that the Father was vindictive or punitive. A terrible concept. Now, Stephen, it is your turn. Please go ahead.
The idea of sacrifice is a huge topic. To equate sacrifice, the idea of sacrifice with only one form of it, which Andre was mentioning, that's called propitiation, where you're giving the deity something in order to assuage the deity's anger or displeasure. There are several motivations for sacrifice, and that's only one of them. There's also expiation, which is forgiveness of sins, where you try to kind of reconcile yourself with the deities. So you have to understand that the Jewish people lived with their God in a covenant, and it was a loving covenant. Okay, they believed that Yahweh would be faithful to them if they were faithful to Yahweh. It was a relationship of choice and a relationship based on love and affiliation. The idea that it was all about appeasing an angry God is, I think, more an imposition, an anachronistic imposition of 17th century Protestantism than it is an accurate portrayal of what the Hebrew religion was all about. So this happens consistently in Christianity, where they're taking the ideas of the early Reformation and then importing them back into the Jewish religion. I'll just read a selection here from a paper on the sacrifice of Isaac, which many Christians believe was there to appease an angry God. It had nothing to do with that, actually, nor did Paul believe that it did. It had to do with confirming that relationship of covenant and that relationship of loyalty of Abraham to his God and Abraham's God to Abraham, and then to all of Abraham's descendants, which were meant to include all the Gentiles as well. So I think as readers of the Urantia book, we have to be very, very careful about using these very outdated, theologically speaking, nobody believes this stuff anymore about sacrifice has only one idea, which is to assuage an angry God. That is an idea that's no longer accepted, even among Christian theologians. So I'll just read the short quote. He's talking again about the burnt offering, which was described in Genesis and the story of Abraham and Isaac. From the special occasions of its celebration as given above, it may be inferred that it was honorific and devotional, implying homage to Yahweh and a complete surrender to his service. So that is, again, another definition and another motivation for what sacrifice was. So I just want to correct the record because it's very, very common in the Urantia book and among Urantia book readers who don't have a lot of background in this area. And by the way, there is a Urantia book reader that we all know, Steve Finland, who is an expert, a world-renowned expert on these topics. And he's got 3 or 4 books out that are very, very learned, and he is well known in the literature on this topic, as a matter of fact.
Stephen, thank you for clarifying the implications in Judaism pertaining to sacrifice. I think our focus predominantly has to do with how the custom and theological views inserted themselves into Christianity. The equation with Jewish practice is fairly complicated, as you have said. But what happened ultimately in terms of the understanding of Christians and the teachings of Christian leaders was the idea that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and that his death on the cross created a pathway that allows believers to go to heaven in the traditional framework. And I submit to you that that explanation is not old, is not set aside, that the Christian tradition still embodies the conviction that Jesus died on the cross for our sins. And so even though that is not the Jewish concept, nevertheless, this concept of a propitiation on Jesus's part is an active element in traditional Christianity today.
Remember, we were trying to talk about the influence of Judaism on Christianity, and we ended up talking about the Christian perversion of Jewish ideas. So let's not conflate these two things. We reversed our direction there.
Well, I understand what you're saying. I think our topic is predominantly the characteristics of Christianity, and we have been trying to infer where certain ideas came from. I accept that the concepts of sacrifice were indeed modified. If you wish to use the word perverted, I certainly do not object. Does anyone else wish to contribute to this discussion? All right, gentlemen, I have now explained to Bob that I would like to turn to the excerpt from pages 112 and 113 of the long essay, Revelation Revealed, that all of you received as an attachment to the reporting message that I sent concerning our webinar last week, November 30th. This excerpt from Revelation Revealed concerns the books of the Old Testament, and particularly the distortion of history that these convictions in Judaism represented. So I would now ask Bob to share the screen for this page, and we will proceed to read the paragraph at the top of the page and the 3 excerpts that follow by asking you to take turns. All right. I
Should
will.
be shared. Is it shared now? I just want to make sure you're all seeing what I'm seeing. Okay,
I am seeing it, yes.
great.
I will read the introductory paragraph at the top of the page and will then call on individuals to read the excerpts. The introductory paragraph reads as follows. In terms of content and substance, the paramount concerns associated with the Old Testament stem from the distortions and misrepresentations that the Hebrew priests propounded during their exile in Babylon, while conducting their systematic editing of previous writings. These efforts of the Hebrew priests ultimately produce, quote, a fiction of sacred history, unquote, that has been, quote, disastrously exploited by both Jewish and Christian writers. Remarks by Melchizedek in paragraphs 5 and 6 of section 8 in paper 97. Andre, would you be available to read the first excerpt, which begins, the custom of looking upon the record?
Got it?
Thank you.
The custom of looking upon the record of the experiences of the Hebrews as sacred history, and upon the transactions of the rest of the world as profane history, is responsible for much of the confusion existing in the human mind as to the interpretation of history. And this difficulty arises because there is no secular history of the Jews. After the priests of the Babylonian exile had prepared their new record of God's supposedly miraculous dealings with the Hebrews, the sacred history of Israel as portrayed in the Old Testament, they carefully and completely destroyed the existing records of Hebrew affairs. Such books as The Doings of the Kings of Israel and The Doings of the Kings of Judah, together with several other more or less accurate records of Hebrew history. Melchizedek, 1074.
Thank you. Stephen, would you be prepared to read the next excerpt that begins with the words, when the Jewish priests returned to Jerusalem? You're muted, Stephen. We can't, okay.
When the Jewish priests returned to Jerusalem, they had already completed the writing of their narrative of the beginnings of things. Soon they made claims that this recital was a recently discovered story of creation written by Moses. But the contemporary Hebrews of around 500 BC did not consider these writings to be divine revelations. They looked upon them much as later peoples regard mythological narratives. This spurious document, reputed to be the teachings of Moses, was brought to the attention of Ptolemy, the Greek king of Egypt, who had it translated into Greek by a commission of 70 scholars for his new library at Alexandria. And so this account found its place among those writings which subsequently became a part of the later collections of the sacred scriptures of the Hebrew and Christian religions. And through identification with these theological systems, such concepts for a long time profoundly influenced the philosophy of many Occidental peoples. 838, 3-4.
Thank you. That's the page number in the original version published in English. It corresponds to paper 74, section 8, paragraphs 11 and 12. George, would you please proceed to read the final segment here that begins with the words, all modern religions?
Sure. All modern religions have seriously blundered in the attempt to put a miraculous interpretation on certain epochs of human history. While it is true that God has many times thrust a father's hand, a providential intervention, into the stream of human affairs, it is a mistake to regard theologic dogmas and religious superstitions as a supernatural sedimentation appearing by miraculous action in the stream of human history. The fact that the Most High's rule in the kingdoms of men does not convert secular history into so-called sacred history. New Testament authors and later Christian writers further complicated the distortion of Hebrew history by their well-meant attempts to transcendentalize the Jewish prophets. Thus has Hebrew history been disastrously exploited by both Jewish and Christian writers. Secular Hebrew history has been thoroughly dogmatized. It has been converted into a fiction of sacred history and has become inextricably bound up with the moral concepts and religious teachings of the so-called Christian nations. Paper 97, section 8, paragraphs 5 through 6.
Thank you, George. For the sake of our subsequent discussion, I believe it is sufficient now for Bob to remove the screen sharing and for us to continue discussing in our normal way. Thank you. So by implication, there are several elements of this that are at the very minimum problematic. One element has to do with the conviction among many Christians that the Bible and everything it contains is an infallible work, completely correct. And then, if that is the case, the various stories about Hebrew history are factual. If that is likewise the case, then it provides a concept of how God intervenes in human history in a very selective way for the sake of helping a particular group of people, if you prefer, a particular nation or country. And this in turn creates the impression that God actively intervenes in human affairs of a political character. I suggest to you that that conviction is profoundly damaging, and it contributes to the overtones of the chosen people syndrome that we partly discussed last week. Now, in fairness, the conviction that God assists one's own country is a very common conviction in the history of the development of religious thought. The various pagan religions all predicated the idea that a particular God would benefit their city, their country, what have you. And so this concept that draws upon inaccurate portrayals in the Old Testament does resemble the convictions of many pagan religions that existed contemporaneously and beforehand. The other difficulty with it in a theologic sense is the concept that God particularly favored the Hebrew people and therefore particularly favors the Christians who succeeded the Jewish believers, because in the conventions of Christianity, the beliefs about Jesus descended from Judaism, and Christianity adopted the Hebrew scriptures in the ways that Christians describe as the Old Testament. So, gentlemen, we have quite a range of difficulties here. I suppose that if we subject ourselves to a cultural comment, the fact that the Hebrew people were liberated from bondage in Egypt was conceptually useful to African Americans who believed that God would liberate them from slavery in the United States. And so these stories from the Old Testament have been applied to many social, economic, and political issues in ways that are at least unfortunate. Although I suppose that African Americans treasured that story of the liberation from Egypt of the Hebrews and thought it was an excellent example of God intervening on behalf of his chosen people. All right, gentlemen, I've said quite a bit. We've read quite a few excerpts. I wonder who would like to start the discussion. Since I don't have any takers on that, I will simply have to succumb to my temptation of calling on someone. And in this case, that person will be Bob.
Somehow I felt I might get this one first. Couple of things here. I'd like to start off by making a comment back to what Steve had said. He made me think a little bit. I'm going to reflect on what you said, Steve, as to the causality of this picture of God being this almost an unlikable personality. Not the real loving type personality that Jesus portrays. And I wrote down a note to myself, cause and effect, and I just Neil, you had asked for some comments after. I was kind of trying to process what Steve had said to be able to do that, and then I'll get back to what you're asking here, and I'll throw a couple thoughts out. Dr. Barry Wilson, I've brought this up before, is when we came to this particular subject, I thought I'd go to a real good scholar and also a Jewish Hebrew scholar, and he's got a book that I've brought up before. It's called and it's on Kindle. I've been reading it on the Kindle. It's called How Jesus Became a Christian, and I think, Steve, if I would support what you said, his theory is, as he gets through some of the discussion about Isaiah and Acts, etc., is that Paul had turned this idea of Jesus and all the messages of Jesus into the what he calls the Jesus cover-up thesis. And let me read a section on that to kind of support this. He says, according to my Jesus cover-up thesis, there was an important shift away from the teachings of Jesus to those about the Christ. If you remember last webinar, I said that the revelators in the papers only refer to either historically using the word Christ as Christianity does, or they use it as Christ Michael, explaining that the term of Christ being the anointed, of course, is directly attributed to Michael, the personality of Michael, not the person, and not the person of Jesus. He says that is, beliefs about the person of Jesus conceived of as a Christ came to obscure what he said and did. Thus the religion of Jesus, the one Jesus practiced and taught, became transformed into a cult about the Christ. So he gets that right as far as I'm concerned, from the Revelation, and then proceeds to talk about this cause and effect, and about how the Christians became the chosen ones, as you brought up, Neil, and very insidiously moved away the concept that the Jews and the Hebrews, I should say the Jews, were really the chosen ones. So this idea of chosenness is something that seemed to perpetuate. All right, so that was a point about what Steve brought up there. I did mark this third writing, this third paragraph here, or I should say the third block, with the word transcendentalize the Jewish prophets. Transcendentalize is an interesting term. That entire 2 paragraphs that George just read by the Melchizedek in paper 97 kind of really addresses a very strong rebuke about how secular history has been thoroughly dogmatized. So I think it pays to read it again, in the light of, okay, this is the Melchizedek trying to tell us that this is an area that we need to consider. And one of the ideas was that where he says that the distortion of the Hebrew history by the well-meant attempts to transcendentalize the Jewish prophets, as to idealize them and to take them and step them up above humanness. Getting into this idea of national heroes, etc., we tend to transcendentalize our national heroes. And I think that the Revelators tell us that this idea of ancestor worship and transcendentalizing individuals, such as prophets, is a it is a theme that seems to go through all of our societies and civilizations from East West combined. So that kind of struck out. And also what really struck out to me was how strong the Melchizedek talks about this particular concept. I'll throw it back to the group. Neil, over to you.
Thank you. There are many different strands, and we could expend a great deal of time exploring all of them. I would like to focus on one particular element in order to ask a specific question to Stephen. This element corresponds to the sentence that I highlighted in bold in the second excerpt, and the sentence in particular is as follows: but the contemporary Hebrews of around 500 BC did not consider these writings to be divine revelations. They looked upon them much as later peoples regard mythological narratives. So now my question to Stephen is, if this was the fairly common view of Jewish believers in the centuries that led to the birth of Jesus, why did later Christian believers take all of these stories about the history of Israel and Judah to be fact?
Well, I'm not sure that the actual difference between fact and myth was very significant at that point in time. The idea of a fact is a very modern conception. Facts per se did not really exist before let's say maybe the 16th century, as we understand the fact. Historical facts were extremely malleable, to put it mildly. And there was no real dividing line between what we called fact and what we called myth. So I just have a little bit of trouble interpreting what that actually means. They had no conception back in 500 BC of verification of facts. Okay, it was either in your tradition or it wasn't. And to say that something was in your tradition, but it was critically examined and considered not to be factual, that kind of thinking did not exist. Again, I don't see this as really particularly relevant to much of anything. I don't think facts per se, as we understand them, really were a factor.
Let me, before I recognize George, pursue you slightly on this. If your view is that in, shall we say, ancient times, the distinction between facts and myths was rather hazy, that was not the case at the time of the Protestant Reformation or subsequent reading of the scriptures in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And various Christian believers who were intent on studying the scriptures regarded all these stories as factual. Now, is there an observation that you would wish to share with us about why they did that?
Naivete, lack of historical investigation at that time. Those ideas that were prevalent in the 16th, 17th centuries became gradually outdated and outmoded when actual scientific investigation proceeded into the history of the Jewish people, and that included archaeology, included textual criticism. So those ideas were prevalent because they had no competitors. And of course, they had to start with that as a kind of a default, I suppose. That's not hard to understand, but they quickly and consistently lost ground as more and more actual research was done into these issues.
Thank you, George. You've asked to speak next.
Yeah, I just would point out a couple of things on this issue about the difference between myth and fact. Paper 139, midwayers tell us that, quote, if Jesus and his work had not been genuine, it could not have held a man like Thomas from the start to the finish. He had a keen and sure sense of fact. So there's that, right? I don't think it's fair to characterize everyone who dwelt in this planet before the 1600s as being ignorant about the existence of fact. The second issue worth considering is that the model, in fact, the person who was called for almost 1500 years, the philosopher, was Aristotle. And you can't read Aristotle without coming away with the conviction that he had a sure and keen sense of fact. So those are my comments.
Thank you, George. I would now like to turn to Andre. And Andre, I'm going to give you a slightly different opening. The last webinar, you specifically asked me to give you a particular prompt instead of merely providing a carte blanche. So with that in mind, I will give you a particular prompt. I would like you to comment, if you could, on the implication that God intervenes in the politics of nations and favors certain countries by defending them or protecting them from their enemies, and why this indeed entered into the Christian tradition and became a theme.
Well, I certainly couldn't speak authoritatively on why it entered Christianity as a theme. However, we might surmise that a chosen people doctrine had elements that infected, the Christian stream of thinking, and we'd probably be correct in that surmise. At least we can't see very much alternative as to what another source would be to inject that kind of thinking, except that, nationalisms always create a certain national ego alongside them. That said, what strikes me as interesting about this is that while a chosen people attitude might have been justifiable or might theologically be adhered to in the past, one can only wonder at how it can be adhered to at all in the present, considering how much the Jews themselves were persecuted. And I know you're talking largely about Christianity at this point, but just going back to that for a moment, there still is among Orthodox Jews a chosen people attitude, despite the fact that, clearly if God was on your side in, before the Common Era, why is he still not on your side? What happened? What happened in Nazi Germany? Not to be flippant about it. That is a clear data point that should have, if beliefs were factually based, and Stephen makes some excellent points about that, as well as George, that some people, not everybody had a view of what fact really was back in those days, and fact and myth were largely interchangeable. Nevertheless, there were people all through the ages, just as there are now, people that regard fact as important, and though almost in equal numbers, it would seem, throughout the world, those that disregard it. My point is that somehow there's a certain viewpoint that says beliefs generally are factually based, or at least they should be in a scientific age. And clearly what we see here is that beliefs are not. But getting back to that, the idea that the hand of God is in civilization is clearly a valuable idea that's supported by the Urantia book in the form of the Most High's rule in the kingdoms of men. The real difficulty with any such notion is that none of us is competent to know exactly how that hand operates through human history. We might, in retrospect, possibly surmise something, but we're on very, very unsteady ground when we do so, because the viewpoint of the Most Highs must embrace tens of thousands of years, whereas ours can embrace, if we're lucky, a century at a time.
Thank you. I would like to bring up a very specific a very specific incident of the conviction that God was on the side of a particular military struggle, and an incident that is very embarrassing to us now. In the 1860s, the United States went through a terrible civil war, and I am not going to recount the events of that civil war, but I am interested in the psychology of believers in Christianity on both sides. And unfortunately, the religious leaders on both sides were inclined to cite different portions of the Bible with the overtones that God supported them. They could deduce that God was in favor of the cause of the Union, or that God was in favor of the cause of the rebellious states in the South. Furthermore, the argument about God being in favor of particular social systems included the issue of slavery, whereby some sincere believers and religious leaders in the southern part of the United States read portions of the Old Testament which talked about slavery and used them as evidence that God is in favor of slavery. Furthermore, that since God is in favor of slavery, he would give victory to their arms on the field and their rebellion against the northern states that remain faithful to the US Constitution. So my question to you, George, has to do with this process of transcendentalizing that Bob described, whereby the words of scriptures are interpreted to mean justification for political regimes and countries and political causes. Could you comment on any of these ideas?
Yeah, I particularly like Bob's discrimination or focus on the difference between sacred and profane history, which is such a bias. It's such a complete misrepresentation of what I believe God is. He has his plans, and he does rule in the kingdom of men. But as Andre said, we have no idea how he does that, when he does that, where he does that. We just have to admit our complete ignorance. But in the case of the Civil War, people, like you said, Bob pointed out, we Christianity and the Hebrew religion, Judaism, both transcendentalize the prophets, which, they elevate them to the point where their moral pronouncements become spiritual laws. So if you take that approach, you can find a justification for anything in the Bible, even murder. There is no limit. If you're willing to pick and choose, cherry pick the particular line or statement that you want to support your position, you can find it in the Bible, and you can find a prophet who said it. So it's just so intellectually and spiritually dishonest is just dishonest. That's what strikes me about this whole thing. It's just not, there's no spiritual integrity to it. So that's my rather strong feeling on the whole matter.
George, thank you for your candid comments, and I fully understand your strong feelings. We are exchanging views, and I treasure the diversity of opinion and the pluralism of voice that this group of people, including you, most emphatically represent. Now, I wonder whether we have reached a reasonable conclusion to this consideration, the difficulties in regard to the Old Testament. Stephen would like to address us. Thank you.
Yeah, in the interest of diversity, I'd like to present a different perspective on this. I actually wrote something up. It's fairly short, but I just wanted to be coherent in what I said about it. So I want to address the question of providence in the Urantia book. And providence is an authentic term in the Urantia book. And I'll base my statements on that idea to begin with. So it said in paper 121, the Jews viewed history as the providence of God, Yahweh at work. Providence is defined in paper 118 in its eternity meanings as he ponders the universe fact. I'll say it again. But man can even now foretaste this providence in its eternity meanings as he ponders the universe fact that all things, be they good or evil, work together for the advancement of God-knowing mortals in their quest for the Father of all. All right, so this is definition of providence. The Jews as a people believed in the providence of God, and I'll just read this at this point. The Hebrew Bible treats the secular history of the Hebrew tribes in an analogous manner to how the Urantia book deals with planetary and cosmic history. Neither of the two ignores secular history, i.e. there is a good deal of historical, semi-legendary or legendary detail in the Old Testament. Whether or not all those details are demonstrably factual is another matter. The significant point here is that the purpose of the formulation of sacred history in the Hebrew Testament is identical to the purpose of the FER, Fifth Epical Relation. That is, to communicate the fact that a purely secular conception and understanding of human origins and destiny is false and destructive. There is no separation between the secular and the sacred, historically speaking, in the sense that secular reality only exists in the context of the sacred. That is, because of the reality of its divine origin and destiny. The Hebrews knew and understood their divine origin and destiny, and that of all nations, because they accepted the terms of the covenant that was offered to them by Yahweh as described in their sacred history. Second, the sacred history of the Jews as preserved in the Torah created and supported their self-identity and what enabled them to persevere as a people so as to overcome repeated occupations and military defeats over the centuries. Crucially and amazingly, this perseverance even flowered as a diaspora in the form of 200 synagogue-based communities throughout the Roman Empire, and therein, quoting the Urantia book, therein provided the cultural centers in which the new gospel of the kingdom of heaven found initial reception, and from which it subsequently spread to the uttermost parts of the world, paper 121. In addition, the self-understanding of the Jewish people, in large part due to their shared historical identity as being in a covenantal relationship with God, promoted, quote, the centralization of the Jewish temple worship at Jerusalem, which constituted alike the secret of the survival of their monotheism and the promise of the nurture and sending forth to the world of a new and a large concept of that one God of all nations and father of all mortals. The temple service at Jerusalem represented the survival of a religious cultural concept in the face of the downfall of a succession of Gentile national overlords and racial persecutors. Paper 121. So there's a lot in there, but I just wanted to say that many people would look at the Urantia book as creating a sacred history for the universe, and certainly for the planet. That does not eliminate secular history, of course, but incorporates secular history into a larger sacral context. So that's the general similarity, I would say. And that's encapsulated in the idea of providence.
Thank you. Before I recognize Bob, who was asked to speak, I would like to give two brief types of reaction to what you have just said. First, thank you very much. As a practical matter, since you have written down what you have just said on paper, would you be please willing to send me the document that will facilitate my task of reporting on it in connection with the next report, the report corresponding to today's webinar? The second point, I think, is to express considerable sympathy with your explanation of the idea of providence. One can say, I think with complete conviction, that the portrayal of the epical revelations as a series and the portrayal of God's plans for our planet Urantia and for the universe of universe does represent a policy that can correctly be described as providence. So I would personally go back to a concept that effectively Andre expressed earlier, that we do know that the Most Highs rule in the kingdoms of men, but we do not know how, we do not know the details. And so the difficulty that we have in this connection has to do with interpreting the stories of the Old Testament, which in effect amounted to asserting that God was acting on behalf of the Hebrew people in their struggles with their neighbors. And then the conclusion that Christians subsequently reached, that God was on their side in their fights, in their wars. So I would now recognize Bob for his comments.
Thanks, Neil. I have three real quick things, but nothing ever happens quick in these webinars because we get extra thoughts as we start speaking. So I'll try to do this as best I can. We are comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the tenets and practices of organized Christianity. So I wanted to kind of bring it back to that topic a little bit. It occurred to me just this past week that maybe there's a way to what are the true teachings truthfully. We talk about some of these things periodically, and this idea of fact versus myth kind of came into my mind here. What is a fact and when do we get myth? And of course, the papers talk a lot about fact versus truth. You can get the facts entirely wrong, but the truth entirely right. We've had some examples of that. To do a side by side though versus the facts, and this is kind of what I did. I'm not sure that I was thinking ahead on some of this, but I took paper 155, which we've been in there before. Why did the heathen rage? And the second paragraph, there's a very interesting statement in there. Now these, the reason I took paper 155 is that there's a lot of direct quotes that the midwayers interpreted it for us to read about what Jesus said to the apostles. And he says that my Father does not sit in heaven laughing in derision at the heathen. He was talking about to the apostles and to the folks that were with him that they're going to face some lots of problems because these heathens, the pagans, are going to come back and attack them a bit. So I thought, okay, well, is there anything that's in the Bible that mimics that? And in fact, it does. I used Dwayne Faw's paramony, which is a very difficult thing to follow, but at least you can get where these match up. And I can mention these right here, right now. It's Acts 4:25 to 26. I'm sorry, 25 to 28, Psalms 2:11, 1 John 3:12, Isaiah 56:5, and Romans 2:9. In all of those, it's stated directly opposite that that God laughs. And Jesus, so the fact that we're getting from the Revelation is a cleanup of that statement. So I got thinking about, what did this do to the 2,000-year history as this idea that that my Father sits in heaven laughing in derision at the heathen? It goes back to this idea of chosen people. We're chosen. He's not laughing at us. And it got me thinking a little bit about the true teachings of Jesus have to be somewhat factual based. Now, whether he said this exactly, whether the midwayers had to translate that a little bit from what maybe he spoke a little bit in allegory, but what we have here today in the Revelation is a fact that that the Father is no respecter of persons, and the Bible has that. And as George brought up, there's these cognitive dissonances in the various biblical accord. So facts count. Today they count, and I thought that I would bring that up because the truth is that the Father is no respecter of individuals. Providence to me is almost like the planet itself. The Gaia hypothesis claims that the planet is such a system that it works with the biological, with both the animate and the inanimate on the planet, and it adjusts. Well, I see Providence as the supreme being making adjustments to what's going on in the universe. There were some adjustments made during the Lucifer rebellion that clearly were very large and providential. And the other one I wanted to make, the other point was paper 74, where we read, let me make sure I got this right. We read paragraphs 11 and 12. And I got thinking about the same idea of fact versus truth, or fact versus myth, actually. And maybe it's important to read the paragraph in front and the paragraph below, because this Jewish tradition crystallized about Moses was in the first paragraph, and then the Christian teachers perpetuated the belief in the fiat creation of the human race. But it all goes back to this mythology, not facts. The facts aren't right, but the truth is that it goes all the way back to Dalmatia, is what they what the revelatories here have actually explained to us. So with 200,000 years of time, facts turn into myths. There's just no two ways about it. Back over to the group.
Thank you. You've finally persuaded me to succumb to a temptation that I considered earlier in the webinar, the word facts as opposed to myths. But the temptation pertains to a statement made by a counselor for the current U.S. administration. I will not give her name, and I will not give the name of the gentleman who is sitting as her fearless leader. But in one public statement, she came out with the term, quote, alternative facts, unquote. The idea that one is entitled to have different facts depending on your alternative viewpoints. And I think, frankly, that, at least from my perspective, is an appalling idea, that one has a right to adjust the facts for one's personal convenience. But it does correspond a bit to the concept that we discussed during this webinar of interpreting findings, interpreting statements in the scriptures to suit one's own political or social or economic convenience. And it is a very old tendency in humanity. I will not go beyond that. Does anyone else wish to speak at this point? Stephen?
Just very briefly regarding fact and interpretation, there is a third way between the idea of alternative facts and only one set of facts being relevant. When rabbis interpret the Torah, the more interpretations, the better. There is no idea that there is one single correct factual interpretation of any text. Texts, by definition, texts are multifactual, or there are many, many different ways to interpret a single text. One interpretation may or may not be more valid than the other, but that does not mean that one interpretation is factual and the others are non-factual. So the idea of fact when interpreting a text in rabbinical tradition is basically irrelevant. So I just want to throw out that idea. And as far as what George said about Aristotle, that may be true, but Aristotle and people who were living in Babylon in 500 BC didn't really live in the same kind of world. So facts may have had more relevance for somebody like Aristotle who understood what empiricism was. But there's a big difference between those two kinds of cultures. So I'll let that go.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on your point about interpretation among different rabbis and scholars. And the practice of diverse viewpoints, I think, is a very healthy one. Unfortunately, the Christian tradition did not adopt that approach. It adopted the approach of enforcing uniformity. Doctrine had to be understood in a particular way. And the history of Christianity for the last 2,000 years is absolutely littered with instances in which a majority, or at least a politically influential faction, imposed its own interpretation of doctrine on others. And people died for that in many instances. The other point that I would offer you is that interpreting ideas is different from changing facts. The problem we have has to do with reality as opposed to interpretation. And I think all of us believe that a fact, an event that describes something objective in the world is different from an interpretation of a principle or a conclusion, an analysis, a hypothesis. We do have a difference from the perspective of objective reality that distinguishes facts from opinions. And I think that difference is very important for the purposes of our discussion, and for that matter, for the purpose of understanding the evolution of Christianity. All right, gentlemen, I will now draw a line under our discussion of the Revelator's analysis of the distortions in what we call the Old Testament, involving a perversion of historical fact, perversion of myths. I would now like to profit from one of the insights that Stephen has shared with us previously, a number of times during our immediately previous webinar on November 30th, his phrase, acculturation, the idea that the teachings of Jesus and the evolution of Christianity was influenced by the culture of Western countries and necessarily changed because of that. I believe that this is true and that is a very important insight. Now, I would like to apply this to a case in Christianity that actually represents an acculturation to the practices of the pagan civilizations and a distinction from the principles of Judaism. Judaism maintained a strong prohibition against what is called graven images, the idea that representations of human beings or animals were not allowed. The Christians, however, did not accept that as an inheritance from Judaism. And very rapidly, portrayals of Jesus, portrayals of his mother Mary, portrayals of various saints generated images that were revered. These images, on the one hand, can be defended in traditional Christian theology as an evocation of the spiritual purpose underneath. And I think traditional theologians, both in the Latin West and the Orthodox East, will maintain very strenuously that believers are not worshiping the image. They are venerating the spirit associated with the image and perhaps expressing the hope that the spiritual power of the individual represented will be helpful to their cause in a spiritual sense. Now, what is the point here? The point is that this veneration of images became extremely controversial at a major stage of the history of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which emphatically did not fall in the year 476 CE. People in our day call it the Byzantine Empire, but in fact, it was simply the eastern half of the Roman Empire that continued. In the middle of the 600s, the eastern half of the Roman Empire was under assault from the Arabs, who were coming from the east and attacking the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. Well, the Arabs, like the Hebrew tradition, preserved the prohibition on images. And the Byzantine armies were losing, or at least were in great danger of being overrun. So in the Greek Orthodox civilization of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which we call Byzantine, there was a movement that we subsequently have called iconoclasm. The veneration of icons was challenged. Different emperors of the Byzantine Empire came out in favor of the veneration of icons or the elimination of them, and people were killed over this. So this era of iconoclasm and conflict, wherein the supporters of the veneration of icons are sometimes called iconophiles, went on for several generations until the late 700s. Now, what is the point of this? The point of this is that the tradition of venerating images was a departure from the tradition of Judaism and was actually carried forward from the practices of pagan religions. Now, to make this perhaps a little bit more relevant, the veneration of saints and images of saints became extremely controversial in the 16th century, whereby many Protestant annalists and clergymen attacked the Roman Catholic practices of art depicting saints, depicting the Virgin Mary, and used the arguments that derive from the tradition of Byzantine conflict over icons. Now, as far as I know, the word iconoclasm is the only word from Byzantine history that has entered the English language, but it is there. And it literally means an attack on icons. So I would ask for comment on the distinction whereby Christianity actually became a culture to the practices of pagan religion by producing images of Jesus on the one hand, but also Mary and various saints that were then venerated, followed by extended controversy over the merits of these images and the implicit attribution of spiritual power to the images themselves. George, would you talk about why this became controversial during the Protestant Reformation?
Well, I guess it goes back to the previous topic, the sacred history of the Hebrew people and Judaism's well-documented disapproval of any sort of art. To my way of thinking, I'm not going to be able to back this up with any sort of readings or sightings, but off the top of my head, it occurs to me that Christianity never would have penetrated the West if it had not accommodated the Greek appreciation for beauty, including art. So that's my simplistic answer to your complicated question.
Well, George, thank you for calling it complicated. I meant to give you a range of ways of reacting. I see Andre smiling. That's a mistake because now I'm going to call on you, sir.
Well, I appreciate George's candor in that answer as well. I don't have much to add here, but I do have anecdotally something that occurs to me. I grew up in a Polish Catholic family, and one of the iconic images in Polish Catholicism is Our Lady of Częstochowa, also known as the Black Madonna. And what strikes me as you're talking about this is how these images are used, and how I was taught as a Catholic about the nature of these images. And it was very, very clear, both in catechism and in other Catholic teachings, even as a young lad, that I was being told that we do not venerate the statue. We do not venerate the image. We are venerating the symbol, what is behind the image. This is a difficult concept to get across to anyone, let alone children. But at some point, though, I mean, at least it did get across to some people, and the point was being made that this is not idolatry. In reality, it is the use of an image to evoke some reverence. I think about the fact that symbolically, it always was kind of on the edge, even as a kid, when on Good Friday, we would go up for the veneration of the cross and kiss the feet of Jesus, a brass feet of Jesus on a wooden cross, a large cross that would be brought out for the purpose on Good Friday, and kiss the feet. Now, all this to say, that image, Our Lady of Częstochowa, the Black Madonna, is something that galvanizes the Polish psyche around a religious national identity, something that is laudable and part of their culture and important in bringing the people together who have obviously had to deal with much tribulation through the years. Poland has been referred to as the corridor of Europe, and has been partitioned at least 3 times throughout history. That has an effect on people anytime. And then there's been the Polish diaspora as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact during World War II. So you have all of these kinds of things, and people seize on what is of value that means something. And this, of course, not only harkens to an archetype of the mother with the Black Madonna, but many Urantians now are believing, this is clear symbolism that super consciously is referring back to the mother spirit, in some way. And that's why it has such power. Now, that's all over the map. And why it was brought to mind is these symbols are so pervasive that when I stopped in the meditation chapel in Taipei just last week, about 8 days, 9 days ago, 8 days, there was a picture of Our Lady of Częstochowa in the chapel, in the prayer room in Taipei. These symbols are universal. They are important, and they propagate. And they do so because they have meaning and value to people. And I don't pretend to know the entire religious value of this to people, but it is significant to pay attention to that when we see our own movement evolving and hoping to evolve religious and quasi-religious forms in the development of the society that will naturally grow up around our movement.
Thank you. I would view your comments as yet another example of very profound observations. And so it makes me a bit embarrassed because I am now going to drop down to a very prosaic level for the purposes of my next question that I will address to Bob. Like you, Andre, Bob and I were both brought up as Roman Catholics. And the practice in Roman Catholicism includes the view that a particular saint is in charge or helpful of certain purposes in life. The specific example that I will now put to Bob has to do with a saint called Saint Christopher. There is a question as to whether this was a real person or simply a legend. We do not know. But in any case, the example that I'm going to offer Bob has to do with the belief that Saint Christopher will protect you from accidents. And the idea of putting a little statue of Saint Christopher, almost always a modest affair in plastic, on the dashboard of one's automobile so that one will not get into an automobile accident. I wonder, Bob, if you could comment upon that apparent belief of many otherwise sincere human beings.
Yeah, what an interesting subject. Yes, I have experienced that. I remember as a 12-year-old or so riding down at 80 miles an hour without any seat belts now, thinking about this with the St. Christopher statue sitting on top of the dashboard, exactly as you described it. And, I remember my friend's mother saying, somebody said, you probably shouldn't go so fast on this terrible street. She said, well, we got St. Christopher, he'll protect us. It just didn't ring true even then. But this idea of symbolism, I guess, is important. I don't know. It didn't slow us down anything because Saint Christopher was going to protect us. So, the fact that you have this false thought that there's some kind of special protection going on is not a good thing. But I wanted to also add that symbolism is important. The Melchizedek in paper 85, I think it's the Melchizedek in paper 85. No, it's a Brilliant Evening Star, says that in religion, symbolism may be either good or bad, just to the extent that the symbol does or does not replace the original worshipful idea. And symbolism must not be confused with direct idolatry, wherein the material object is directly and actually worshipped. So symbols are important because and this is a subject unto itself, I suppose, because the symbol itself should be transcendental to the symbol. The object of the actual worshipful idea, I should say the object, but the worshipful idea should transcend this icon. And Andre, yes, I remember this specifically. We're not worshiping. It's not idolatry. We're really worshiping Saint Christopher, which in itself is problematic. And when you lost something, there was another saint that you could go pray to go find these things. The cacophony of all of these saints just really didn't ring true, and I was glad I found the Urantia papers to finally correct all of that, in my mind, even though it was really never confusing because I never accepted it. So, that's kind of a long way to kind of explain it. Yes, I've experienced that, but I did want to add that this idea of symbolism is important. Back to you.
Thank you. I think that, in effect, you have described a major share of the concerns expressed by the Protestant reformers in the 16th century, that there were too many superstitions relatively prevalent among Roman Catholic believers in the hierarchy of the time that actually had the net effect of detracting from the reverence due to God. Because if all of these individual saints are in charge of some portion of human life, what is left for God to do? And I'm paraphrasing this in a way that perhaps may be a bit irreverent. But I do agree on the one hand with the idea of symbolism, but on the other hand, I think we have to be very careful and very concerned with the concept that certain former human beings who are regarded as saints have authority in human life over aspects of human experience and behavior. This is simply a contrast, in my opinion, with the teachings of the Urantia book. Does anyone wish to add to this question of symbolism, saints, images, art, and so on? Yes, sir. Go ahead. You're muted.
Getting a mute. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this idea of national heroes kind of comes to mind. We talked about it a little bit earlier in this, and that there's not much difference between all of this. And if we want to progress as a society, well, at least in the U.S., and I'm seeing it throughout, the planet now. It seems to be the case is that sports takes a very, very large role in all of our societies, in everything we do. And Babe Ruth is a national hero, so much so that when he died, the beer was people lined up all the way around the city. Pretty much, it took like 2 or 3 days for people to come in and pass the beer. Talk about a national hero, and that has since perpetuated. So these this idea of and of course in the East it's ancestor worship and Buddha, etc. So it's not very different. This is a commonality among all religions that I think plays a very large role in the way that our societies operate. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you, Bob. I would comment on the relationship to the principle of matter, mind, and spirit. In effect, these convictions about the direct intervention of God or the saints involve an implied view that spirit takes precedence over matter and mind, and that religious institutions or individuals intervene directly in material events. Unfortunately, those views are rather common. And the distinction among the three fields of matter, mind, and spirit is not well understood at all. I go back to the theme of the importance of understanding the role of mind that we have been discussing off and on for several webinars, wherein the reality of mind as a field of perception of matter and of spirit helps understand the lack of a direct connection between spiritual entities and material events in the world, because spiritual events and material events are both processed through mind. In any case, gentlemen, that's the end of my commercial for the day. I think we have reached a reasonable end to the discussion of the elements of Christianity that descend from the theology of Judaism. And therefore, I propose to go on to subparagraph B of question 4. Please identify and analyze those aspects of Christianity that can be traced to B, certain Zoroastrian teachings. Stephen, may I ask you to introduce that question?
Sure. So what I did was that I extracted various selections from the Urantia book having to do with Zoroaster and Zoroastrianism. There aren't that many, but essentially they state that Zoroaster had contact with some of the missionaries that came down the line to his area of Persia. So he had direct contact with that tradition and that wisdom tradition, and he might well have picked up some of the history as we understand it from Uran's book in terms of the Lucifer rebellion and certain things like that. We don't really know, but the book does state that Zoroaster had contact with Melchizedek missionaries. And we also know that the Jewish people had direct contact with Persian Zoroastrian culture in the, let's say, well, up to the time of Cyrus and even beyond. So that would have been about 600, 650 BC to about 500 BC, roughly speaking. So we can say that a lot of the Melchizedek tradition was passed through Zoroaster, Zoroastrianism to Judaism, and then on to Christianity. And there's even some evidence that some of those traditions were passed directly certain areas of Persia where Christianity took hold directly into Christianity. Anyway, a lot of those ideas have to do with what we call apocalypticism and eschatology. So in other words, that there is a cosmic battle between good and evil. And in the Jewish tradition, that battle was associated with a savior, a Messiah figure, which was also present in Zoroastrianism, and even to the point where there is evidence of a belief in a virgin birth of this savior figure in this cosmic battle. So there are some similarities right there. The idea that the good guys are fighting the bad guys, and the bad guys are demons, are actual personalized or personal demons, is an idea that Judaism and then Christianity inherited from Zoroastrianism. Let's see what else. Yeah, and then there's the Messiah. And also the idea of a resurrection and a judgment. Two crucial ideas, especially in Christianity, was passed on through late Judaism. Scholars think from Zoroastrianism, the first judgment and the second judgment, the soul and the body, was passed on into Christianity through Judaism. So there's quite a lot. Christianity inherited a lot of Zoroastrian ideas through the religion of Mithra, and so that had a big influence in the Mediterranean area, and maybe even directly on Paul as well. So Mithraism was an important intermediary as well.
May I probe just slightly, if my impression is correct? I believe that you have confirmed my original inclination that the cosmic battle between good and evil is an important part of this legacy from the Zoroastrian teachings. And
yeah,
go ahead.
And you just have to wonder, I mean, that's a very unique idea. It's not like that kind of idea would have evolved through what we call natural religion, non-revelational or non-epical religion. That's a sort of a historical statement that this cosmic battle took place and is taking place. And of course, in 600 BC, before the incarnation, Caligastia was free to roam around pretty much to his will. And so it was a very real thing in those centuries before Christ. So that historical aspect of belief, I think does smack of something that was carried down by Melchizedek missionaries and preserved mainly or even uniquely in the Zoroastrian religion.
Andre, could I get your reaction to the fairly common perception in traditional Christianity that the devil is an extremely powerful figure who has great power, and frankly, that the good guys only have a narrow edge over the bad guys, and then we believers are always in danger of being overcome by the wiles and snares of the devil?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it dovetails nicely with what Stephen gave us a very comprehensive list of the legacy of Zoroastrianism. And where it really dovetails nicely as well is, and something that wasn't exactly mentioned by Stephen, but I think that's that the legacy was not just that there was a battle of good against evil, but it evolved within the Zoroastrian teachings that this evil was almost as powerful as the good. And I think that was also partly, that was a direct legacy to Christianity. To me, it almost, I mean, the way I characterize it is almost like the view of the firmament that was classic. We had a two-dimensional view of reality largely throughout the centuries, and back then it was no less so with regard to good and evil. There was no way of really right-sizing these demonic personalities or forces against, an infinite God. There was no concept really of infinity, at least in the class, in the minds of those days. I don't think they could have conceived of more than just proportionality, but proportionality would have been wonderful if that had been transmitted, because to me, I think that's one of the most unfortunate legacies of the transmittal of the battle of good and evil. There is a definite battle of good and evil. There is some vigilance that is necessary, but what was lost in that was the notion that good is so overpowering, and not only that good is a positive reality, whereas evil is only a negative reality. That was lost in the transmission of that. And had that been transmitted, there might have been a good deal less fear passed down through the ages, as well as that being able to be used as a cudgel or as an enforcement of authoritarianism or I'll say authoritarianism. Yeah. The other thing, just parenthetically, that wasn't transmitted was the seven master spirits. And that's curious that was, in the Revelation, we find out that the seven master spirits, or the seven, I forget what they're called in Zoroastrianism. I was studying that about a year ago, really represent the seven master spirits. And that's fascinating, isn't it? But to your point, unfortunate legacy.
Thank you. I would now wish to turn to George, and in doing so, apply this question of the legacy of the battle between good and evil from Zoroastrianism and compare it with the very common superstitions still pertaining to witches and wizards and ghosts and goblins. We have a national celebration on the 31st of October every year. I suppose celebration may be a bit strange, but children like it, and they go from house to house and collect candy. So I suppose from the perspective of the children collecting candy, it is a celebration. But the real point I'm asking, George, if you would comment on it, is to what degree you regard this continuation of beliefs in witches and wizards and ghosts and goblins as an emanation of the old mores, primitive religion, or to the contrary, of the Zoroastrian teachings of the struggle between good and evil, or perhaps rather persuasively, a mixture of both strands. What would you say about that, George?
I would say it's a mixture of all of the above. I mean, we know that primitive man was terrified of ghosts. You know, they even give it a name, ghost fear. So, you know, primitive men from the very beginning were afraid of the invisible world. And I'm not so sure in this day and age that that many people really believe in the existence of an invisible world. I think a lot of this is just entertaining myth, something new, something different from the sort of flatness of secular society. There's really, I mean, what's interesting in the secular world? It's all just the same. It's all just things. And I think that's part of the appeal for a number of people, that this idea that there's something more to the world than what we can see. But at this point in our evolution, I'm not sure really how many people even think such a thing is real. So in terms of good and evil, I mean, there is a relation between. Okay. That's not me, is it?
No, I'm sorry. The phone is ringing on my desk. Do not plan to answer it.
Okay. Yeah, no. So I think there is a definite relation between this belief in an invisible world and this discrimination between good and evil, because, you know, in the secular mindset, what is good is what some group says is good. That's all it is. But in a religious mindset, which is aware of an invisible world, the value of goodness takes on spiritual dimensions. In other words, we may judge something that we can see as being good or not good. But from a religious perspective, people who are religious tend to tie that back to some sort of invisible spiritual reality, which comes from God. So that's a pretty significant difference between thinking of goodness as merely a social convention or an ethical construct or some sort of humanly created attitude. That's quite different than thinking that this value has a supernatural origin in the invisible world.
Thank you. If I could probe just a little bit farther, the fear of ghosts and goblins and witches and wizards and so on is nevertheless propagated toward children. And the children in our day and age are actively frightened by these stories. Why do parents, in effect, perpetrate these deceptions, even though they realize that they are myths and not real?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the premise of your question. I'm not sure children really take it that seriously. I think they enter into the fun of it, but I could be wrong.
Well, I think both possibilities exist. Whether children really are frightened, I'm not sure that I could make a statement that all children are frightened, but I believe you would agree that some children are frightened.
Well, all right, but if pursuing that line of thought, it's worth considering that some people can be casually cruel. You know.
All right, let me be
Especially some
uncasual and certainly not cool, because the preoccupation with witches led to people being arrested and tried and executed.
Oh, I thought we were talking about today, not hundreds of years ago.
I understand. We're going back and forth on these matters because
Okay.
we're talking about the development of Christianity over a period of 2,000 years, which has, of course, included many different strands. So if we accept the idea that in the popular conception, a witch is an emanation of evil, perhaps as part of the struggle between good and evil that Stephen introduced earlier as a descent from Zoroastrianism, we have evidences of a belief in witches, even in very esteemed types of literature. The play by Shakespeare called Macbeth starts off with a conference among three witches. There was a deplorable series of events in colonial Massachusetts, geographically not far from where you live, George, wherein young girls accused of being witches were tried and indeed executed. So is this belief in witches and their evil power, in your view, an example of a survival from primitive religion, or would you say once again that it was partly related to the concept of a struggle between good and evil that came from Zoroastrianism?
Well, I would say there were witches in primitive society before Zoroaster ever developed his theory. So if I'm forced to trace it back, I would trace it back to ghost fear and really primitive religion, not just a few thousand years ago.
Thank you. I now offer an opportunity for anyone else who wants to comment on the descent of ideas in Christianity from Zoroaster. Bob?
Yes, Neil. Just a couple of quick thoughts as to what was the impact is what I've been thinking about it. I can't do any better than what the three gentlemen have already done. Steve started this off with some good lineage, etc. And of course, this concept of where are we today with all of this is something I was thinking about. There was a statement in paper 95 by the Melchizedek that said that original Zoroastrianism was not pure dualism. The revelators tell us quite a bit that evil is black dots against the white background of good, and I suspect that the Salem teachers who had gotten to Zoroaster in the 6th century BC, and which he seems to have been one of the spiritual lights that the papers talk about in the 6th century BC, Gautama being one and Confucius being another. I think there was a fourth. This idea of the fact that good and evil is a dualism creates this antagonism that really doesn't exist. Matter of fact, there's a statement that they say that though the early teachings, this is the early teachings of Zoroaster, did picture evil as a time coordinate of goodness. George brought up the idea of truth, beauty, and goodness is what we're talking about here. It was definitely eternity submerged in the ultimate reality of the good. So we've lost the goodness in this truth, beauty, and goodness, I think, because of the modifications of what happened after Zoroaster. His teachings became modified, and it goes to one thing that I thought was important. Here's the impact that I was going to bring up. It comes to two things. There's a Pauline approach to the spirit and flesh. Well, that's a dualism that has never been rectified. Neil, you talk about let's bring up this this matter, mind, and spirit triad that we need to deal with. That is not happening with a duality of spirit and flesh. It just their two are separate. And then mind is totally forgotten, as you've brought up before, and we've talked about in previous webinars. But I think that the real impact is on this idea of theodicy, that none of the Christian religions have really come to a good, reasonable theological development about what that is, and that's how to explain how a perfect God would nonetheless, have this evil going about. And I think that that's probably the legacy of Zoroastrianism and what came through, not only in the Pauline dichotomy, dualism of spirit and flesh, but also in this idea that without a cosmic picture about what's, how providence will make an adjustment to the supreme, with the supreme being. It's important for evil, which is truly error. The papers give us evil, sin, and iniquity, and they separate those two very strongly. Those three very strongly. But evil and sin are totally different. Evil is basically error in a finite time. So I think that as this cosmic revelation becomes better understood, that we'll truly see, civilization will truly see that evil is only black dots against the background of white good. Over.
Thank you. As a final opportunity for you to give your reactions, I would bring to mind a phrase that we who were raised as Roman Catholics were very familiar with as children, that there were three snares in front of a believer, frequently expressed as, quote, the world, comma, the flesh, comma, and the devil, unquote. Now, this very common belief, in effect, implied a very substantial amount of energy and capability to the devil. There is a negative philosophic implication that the world somehow is evil, otherwise it would not be a snare. And there's also a philosophic implication that the flesh, human beings, our material bodies are evil or subject to evil. Now, do you think, Bob, that this trio of unfavorable effects is part of this idea of the struggle between good and evil, or is it simply a construction from the traditions of Roman Catholicism?
I think it's the former, not the latter. I think that it's got these trace roots that go all the way back to this struggle between good and evil that was not Zoroaster's original teaching. It got morphed. And, it comes into the ideas of heaven and hell. And I think even potentially atonement is a derivative of some of this. If we plotted it out, we'd probably see that many of these things are all related in a network of ideas that built up over time. It's like a ball of twine that, has to be unraveled at some point. I just thought of something. I just finished reading to my grandson, The Time Traveler, written by H.G. Wells in 1896. It was a very short book, of about 180 pages or so, that was annotated on one side with the words on the other side. He's only 5. And the time traveler goes 800,000 years in the future. And what does he find? He finds good and evil. He finds the Eloi and he finds the Morlocks who live in darkness. And it's the struggle between the Eloi and the Morlocks that he deals with. He goes even further into the future, and he finds out that the sun is now coming and dying. So this Malthusian idea in the late 19th century came through, and I have to believe that it was part of this dualism that good and evil are still struggling. So I had to fix some things up as we were reading it, because the Morlocks actually used the Eloi for their food. So we had to fix that one up. Over.
Thank you. I think basically the net idea that I take from this discussion of the elements of Zoroastrianism is that this issue of good and evil, and whether good is prevailing or is eventually going to prevail, but that evil is extremely powerful, is still a part of conventional, traditional Christianity. I'm not sure it amounts to a dogma, announced by particular findings of the organized churches, but it seems to be an important part of traditional belief among average believers. Whether a bishop could emit a theological analysis may not be relevant, because these views of good and evil are still alive among traditional believers who call themselves Christians, and perhaps they may eventually yield to a more enlightened understanding based on the teachings of the Urantia book. But I would comment on George's view that some of these conceptions and concerns really do trace back to the primitive mores and have not left. The teachings of the Urantia book confirm that ghost fear is extremely ancient, and indeed it has not left us. Stephen?
This has not been introduced, but Zoroastrianism is able to integrate the idea of a monotheistic God, a single supreme deity, with this battle between good and evil. And that's really crucial. It was able to hold both of those ideas together. If it did not include a monotheistic God, I don't think it would have had the resonance that it did with the Jews or with Christianity later. So that's something we did not mention, but it's very, very important. And that also goes back, I think, to its contact with the Melchizedek's teachings, because obviously they would have been monotheistic in nature as well.
Thank you for that useful and interesting addition to our understanding. Gentlemen, I would propose to continue on with sub-element C of question 4. Please identify and analyze those aspects of Christianity that can be traced to (C), Greek philosophy. And I think the logic of this question compels me to draw on the same participant who just spoke, because the elements of Greek philosophy are a topic that you commented on previously, in effect stating that many of the analytical comments in the Urantia book involve adoption of Greek philosophic terms. Would you be inclined to elaborate and perhaps add additional reflections, Stephen?
Yeah, so I think it's important to realize that without the influence of Greek philosophy, there would be no such thing as Christian theology. They basically are the same thing. Judaism per se did not have a theology as we understand it. It had a religious practice. As it was exposed to Hellenistic influences, it did begin to develop a theology, but nothing like what Christianity developed, because its relationship to Hellenistic influence was a lot stronger. I'll just read this excerpt from the Dictionary of Christian Thought. Christian theology is inherently Hellenic, because it could not exist as a discipline without the kind of intellectual curiosity that was unique in ancient Greece. The ancient Egyptians said that Greeks were like children, always asking why. The Jews asked, why do the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper? But this rises out of a practical concern over the justice of God, and did not incorporate a more generic exploration of what we call now theodicy. Let's see. Greek contrast between being and becoming, the intelligible and the sensible, the soul and the body, with the soul and the intelligible becoming more fundamental and primary, have played rich and diverse roles in Christian thinking. So the idea that the Christian can progress towards holiness and union with God has often included the idea of spiritual mastery of the bodily passions in a fashion similar to that of the Stoics. So not only intellectual ideas, but also the Christian practice of spirituality was based on Greek ideas of soul, spirit, and body, and how one can essentially ascend from the flesh to the spirit. Those are all Greek philosophical concepts that can be traced back primarily to Plato. And of course, later Neoplatonic thinkers developed that in a way that was totally within the Christian tradition. So Platonism gave rise to Neoplatonism, which was essentially Christian Platonism. So I'll just leave it like that.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to get your reactions to an interpretation that I read once, and I cannot place the particular location where I read it. But effectively, this commentary analyzed the beginning of the Gospel of John and stated that the opening words, "in the beginning was the Word," in effect was an echo of Greek philosophy, the idea of logos, that this was a case in which the Greek philosophic concept of the Word became fastened onto the identity of Jesus and by implication to the second person of the Trinity. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, but it was a lot more than that. It was also, there was a tradition in Hebrew thought that there was a wisdom tradition that developed in late Judaism. And that was associated with the idea of a pre-existent wisdom. And of course, Philo, who was Jewish, associated this wisdom tradition, which was could be interpreted in the book of Genesis. He associated that with the idea, the Greek idea of a logos, or of a word. And as it was inherited through John, I think it was a combination of Philo, who combined Judaic belief with Hellenistic thought. So I think really John is a syncretic combination of the two. And I just wanted to read this short definition of logos. Logos is the principle constituting each individual reality and organizing the cosmos. So that's obviously something that could exist as part of Greek philosophy, but never really could exist as part of Hebraic thought. It's just way too abstract for Hebraic thought. So Philo was a really, really crucial stepping stone and connector between Judaism, Hellenism, and Christianity.
Thank you. I would also share with you an interpretation that I recall when I read a biography of Augustine of Hippo, whereby the author stated that Augustine's background in Greek philosophy and interest in Neoplatonic theories gave him this interpretation of the Gospel of John and caused him to look upon the relationship between Jesus as the second person of the Trinity and the conceptual philosophic idea of the Logos. Do you largely accept that too as an influence on Augustine?
Yes, but Augustine was also always in reaction against his own past, which was Manichaean or Manichaeanism, which is extremely dualistic. And so Augustine embraced Greek philosophy as a means of overcoming dualism. And that was his kind of existential path. It was not really a philosophical endeavor as much as it was for him a personal escape from the bonds of what he considers to be pagan dualism.
Thank you. Let me now proceed to take advantage of an insight that you have shared with us more than once. The distinction between the practice of Judaism as being basically a set of ceremonies or observances, compared with the tradition in Christianity of developing doctrine and creeds and very explicit teachings, which I think you have correctly associated with the Hellenistic and subsequently Greek philosophic tradition. I would like to turn to Andre and ask for his comments on the cultural implications of Greek philosophizing and arguing in terms of the development of Christian doctrine that we discussed quite some time ago in earlier parts of this series, pertaining to the doctrines of the Trinity and the identity of Jesus as a member of the Trinity and so on. Was this process of argument and fine-tuning and very complex distinctions implicitly a cultural heritage from Greek philosophy?
Well, I wouldn't pretend to know, but I can't imagine where else it might have come from. It's certainly, I mean, I don't know how much debate there was in, Talmudic scholarship throughout the years. Stephen, I'm sure, could comment on that. But one of the things that strikes me is that we certainly have evidence in that in Nicaea, when they argued over what should be in the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed at the time. And then you certainly see it come about again with many centuries later with Luther, when he finally gets to the point of seeing some of the hypocrisy in Catholic doctrine as it's become overly burdensome for Christians, and rebels against it, pinning up the tracts on the cathedral door there in Germany. But I don't feel competent to really comment more than that. Clearly, we have a tradition of being able to argue about things up to a point, at least once we extricate ourselves from Catholicism. But just replying to what we were talking about in Zoroastrianism, one of the things and one of the legacies of Greek thought that came up for me was this notion of proportion and proportional thinking that was part of the Greek aesthetic and Greek artistic beauty. And what strikes me with that are two quotes out of the Urantia book, and how that still, I won't say it became a solid entrance into Christian thought. We certainly have seen plenty of examples of disproportionate thinking, but it at least made some kind of an entrance. And even if it hasn't, at this point, taking it to present day, one of our ways out of this dichotomous thinking of good and evil is to begin to teach greater proportionality, which is more of a scientific and mathematical attitude that needs to enter the cultural stream. Let me just read these two quotes as part of what I would say to back that up. One is, sorry, it just moved away from me. Oh goodness, now it's going to have problems. I may not be able to do that for you unless this refreshes properly. It's this quote here. There we are. 16, paper 16, section 7, paragraph 7. Man's choosing between good and evil is influenced not only by the keenness of his moral nature, but also by such influences as ignorance, immaturity, and delusion. A sense of proportion is also concerned in the exercise of virtue, because evil may be perpetrated when the lesser is chosen in the place of the greater as a result of distortion or deception. Would argue that that distortion or deception is in our two-dimensional view of good and evil as relatively equal to each other, at least culturally. The art of relative estimation or comparative measurement enters into the practice of the virtues of the moral realm. And then there's another quote about Jesus that harkens to that in terms of his early teaching. And I'm not sure whether that's going to come up very quickly or not. I will leave it just for the sake of time, but it says that he learned from a Damascus teacher a sense in his study of mathematics, and it said numbers, estimation, and proportion, I believe. Estimation may not be part of it, but they specifically mention proportion in that. And when you look at Jesus and his assessment of situations, one of the most admirable aspects of his ability to determine situations and their reality is to really see the relative sense of proportion in that. It's out of paper 123 is where I saw it, and somehow my search engine was having trouble. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Andre. I appreciate these clarifications. The idea of proportionality is indeed an important element in philosophy, and for that matter, an element that applies to religion too. Gentlemen, we've reached the end of the day today in terms of the time available. I think we have just about concluded our discussion of the elements of Christianity that come from Greek philosophy. I would leave you with a thought that I would like to take up at the beginning of the next webinar a week from today. And this has to do with comparing the contribution of Greek philosophy and the tendency to make fine distinctions with the Roman tendency to insist on uniformity of belief and practice, and compare how these two elements, one from Greek philosophy, another effectively from Roman authoritarian government, in how they evolved as influences on Christianity as Christianity developed. So, gentlemen, there we are. That will be the last part of our evaluation of the contributions from Greek philosophy. We will do that next week, and then we will continue with the text in the middle of page 6, and indeed, even more importantly, with formal question B at the bottom of page 6 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. So thank you very much, gentlemen. That's the end of it for today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
See you next week.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.